So you may or you may not be wondering why there are two presenters today. And Liezl and I always like to share a little bit of a background story, and we'll keep this very short. But about a year and a half ago, after qualifying with my master's in teaching MBSR, I felt really good and confidence was high. And then I had a handful of neurodivergent people who expressed an interest in taking an MBSR course with me. And from what they were sharing with me during the intake and the orientation session, it became very clear to me very quickly that I was underprepared. And so I experienced this huge apprehension. But I did not want to cancel the course. I didn't want to come up with some excuse. And what I did instead was I learned as much as I could, as fast as I could. And it was a positive experience. And so I really did learn a lot in over the course of that 8-week program. And then after the program, I wrote about this on LinkedIn, and I said, I'm really keen, and this is sort of the era when Liezl and I met in the MBI training course. And I wrote about the experience on LinkedIn, saying I had a really strong desire based on my experience to share with peers what I had learned, and thinking this might be really helpful to them as well. And somebody commented on that post, a total stranger with ADHD, as it turns out, saying, I would be really interested to know what you learned, because nothing about us without us. And I was like, oh my goodness, what have I done? Who am I to talk about neurodivergence? Anyway, of course, that wonderful stranger was Liezl, and we jumped on a Zoom call. We clicked, we connected, and ever since we have been helping our mindfulness teaching peers develop their neuro-affirming skills. And we do that with our own framework, which is called the Skillful Teaching Wheel, which is based on the MBI TAC. A little bit more about that in a moment. And so we're very grateful that we have this opportunity to share what we know with you as well here today. So Liezl is now going to very briefly go over the agenda and what exactly we mean by an introduction to adaptations. And I'll bring up the slideshow, Liezl.
Super, thank you. Yeah, you can't hide cheeky, can you? It's what got me here. Thank you, Christoph.
I'm glad you did, sure.
Right, so now you can see how to spell my name as well, because I have hidden that behind my business name instead earlier. Right, so the point of giving you an idea of the agenda here is to set the scene. In the same way as when we're teaching participants in a neuro-affirming way, we're going to try and walk the talk with you today so that you get a feel for how it is similar to what you're already doing and how it might be different. So there's only 3 headings here. One is why neurodiversity awareness matters, adaptations using the skillful teaching wheel, and Q&A. We are working really hard to make sure we've got 15 minutes at the end for a proper Q&A. So if you want to scribble down your notes about questions in the meantime, that would be very helpful at the end. Okay. So why does it matter? Why does neurodiversity awareness matter? Well, let's start with you, the clinician or the teacher. It reduces the risk of you unintentionally causing harm. Many of you will have sworn an oath to do no harm first. I know that's not exactly how it goes, but you know what I mean. To increase the awareness of ways in which you can support, including those related to physical and mental health needs, increasing management of sensory and interoceptive differences, and improving teaching clarity, flexibility, and effectiveness. So that's for the teacher or the clinician. So what about the participant or the patient? Well, it's kind of the flip side of the coin, isn't it? So we've got reducing barriers to access, making it easier for people to engage with this, reduces uncertainty, reduces the risk of harm and re-traumatizing, and reduces mindfulness, failure, and shame. So the perception of failing from the participant. And increases autonomy, agency, and learning, which makes life better for all of us. So why wouldn't we want that? There is an important linguistic thing to keep an eye on here. Whenever you look at any documentation around neurodiversity, sometimes people use neurodiverse and neurodivergent as if they're interchangeable. And the neurodivergent community will not thank you for that. The reason for that is the complete difference in meaning between the two things. Neurodiverse relates to a population. A population can be neurodiverse in the way that it has a diversity of neurotypes. Neurodivergent indicates being divergent from that socially constructed norm, which is really just a statistical thing. But it refers to the person. So a person is neurodivergent, a group can be neurodiverse, but not the other way around. Unless the group is neurodivergent because they're all neurodivergent, but now we're getting into semantics just because I can. Okay, thank you. So next step is for Christoph to give us a clue about this wheel.
Thank you, Liezl. And it's so important to understand the difference between those two terms. So always super helpful. So this is a brief introduction to the framework that we are using for our presentation, the skillful teaching wheel. We've chosen the metaphor of a wheel because it symbolizes the teaching in motion, right? And we have 7 spokes, each describing a different aspect of the teaching. And the spokes are compass, considering, connecting, congruence, conducting, conveying, and community. They are very closely mapped on to the domains of the MBI TAC. So that's the resource that Liezl was mentioning a few moments ago. And as you may see, we have 7 spokes, whereas the MBI TAC has only 6 domains. But we've allowed ourselves to add the spoke of compass so that we can really communicate key concepts of neuro-affirming teaching through our own spoke. Yeah, and this framework is not used for assessment purposes, but for really developing our neuro-affirming teaching skills. So please don't worry if you are not overly familiar with the mindfulness-based interventions, teaching and assessment criteria document. You'll be perfectly able to follow using our own framework here today. Before we dive into the spokes separately and in more detail, here is an overview of the spokes. So compass is all about orienting, preparing, and facilitating, because it doesn't just stop at the beginning, right? We facilitate with awareness of neurodiversity, however long your course is, and post-course as well, actually. Considering is all about curriculum, pacing, learning environment, and your materials. Not versus, but and the participant's autonomy, because there's a great deal of things that we have to do, that we have to plan, that we have a curriculum we have to take people through. But actually, can we go about this in the way that we're used to? Maybe not always, and we'll talk about this shortly. Connecting is about relating skillfully to participants of varying neurotypes. Congruence is embodying, really. It's the neurodiversity aware, explicit embodying of mindfulness. Conducting is about guiding the practices with neuro-affirming adjustments. Conveying is about conveying themes, session themes, through neurodiversity friendly access to the inquiry and didactics. You may have noticed that I emphasize the word access because that's what that spoke will be all about. And finally, community, which is about the skillful management of the diverse group context. There is a lot in this presentation. We will be sharing key considerations, key adaptations, but please do bear in mind that this is very much an introductory talk, and we will share a link with you afterwards with to a way more comprehensive resource. And speaking of sharing, the final slide that we have, and then we're going to stop sharing because we very much believe in a sense of connection. Even if we can't really see you, that is absolutely fine. We'll also share a 1-pager quick reference sheet, so you don't feel like you have to write anything down. Of course, you're very welcome to make notes, but this is coming your way. Yeah, so hopefully that is a little bit reassuring. So thank you, everyone. And I'm going to hand over to Liezl, who will now start with the first spoke, compass. Thank you, Liezl. And you're still on mute, my friend. Yeah.
All right, I was going to say we're doing great for time, but now I've wrecked it. Okay, let's move into the first spoke, which is the compass. So the compass is, as it describes, a way of keeping our direction, right? It's a way to keep us safe, and safety is the guiding word for this compass. It doesn't map onto anything on the MBI TAC. This is the one that we added into our teaching wheel. So you might want to ask yourself, when does this bit start? Well, it's not when you do your first session. It's not even when you're doing your intake. It's before that. All the social media stuff you do, any advertising you do, any website stuff you've got going on, signs in the building that you're in, the way that you welcome people into that building, all of those things tell people whether they are safe or not. And so if you're able to take what we're doing today into all of those areas, that's going to be your compass. Keeping safe. The next thing is clear course structure. So in the same way as Christoph and I shared the agenda with you today, it helps people to understand what we're going to cover and in what order, so that if they're feeling lost, they know where to go back to find themselves, and to give them a sense of autonomy, right? If I need to take a break on this bit because I don't want to do it, then I know that I have the choice to come back for that bit. And then there's disclosure and access needs. A percentage of any group that you teach will be neurodivergent. They might not know it yet. We're living in an era where being able to get a diagnosis for some neurodivergent ways of being haven't actually been available before 2008. And so folks won't either know, or they'll suspect, but they won't have a diagnosis, or they won't feel safe enough to tell you. So we can't ask. But we need to be aware that we are dealing with a group that will likely have at least a few people in there who have some way of being neurodivergent. And then awareness of being of intersectional identities. You know, we're all made up of different identities. So I'm a white woman. I happen to be from South Africa. I live in Scotland right now. My first language is a different one from this one. I am cis hetero. What? I had to think then. And I'm a mum. All these things are parts of my identity. And so if we pretend like we're all the same, we're going to be deleting some of those things. And we need to consider how that's going to affect our participants as we go. So at the end of each of our spokes, we're going to invite you to take a moment to pause, to reflect on what we've just covered. We're doing it at quite a lick. We're going quite fast to try and make sure we make the time and say as much as we can. And if any questions come up for the Q&A, maybe this is an opportunity for you to take a note of that. And here's a prompt I can give you if you would like to use it. Of course, your own is entirely valid. How does my intention and my motivation support my direction, this compass I'm going to use? I'll give you a moment, maybe 30 seconds to wrap your head around that. As we're coming to the end of those 30 seconds, I know you may still be scribbling if there's lots to think about. Let's keep going and see if we can catch each other up as we go. Christoph, the next bit is yours, considering.
Thank you, Liezl. And also to say, and I don't know if the group picked up on this, but there was a very important keyword, and you'll find that for each of the 7 spokes, we have a guiding word. Liezl mentioned the word safety. So really compass, the first spoke, is all about safety. And how is that communicated across the marketing materials and the first contacts, etc. So, and throughout the course. And safety links very closely to my spoke, which is the spoke of considering. Considering what? Well, at all times, whether it's with regards to the curriculum, pacing of my teaching flow, the classroom layout and learning environment setup and the materials, considering at all times the participants' autonomy. This domain maps onto the first domain of the MBI TAC, and it's really important to consider autonomy because autonomy is central to the neurodiversity movement. And it's really fundamentally about recognizing that neurodivergent people are full agents of their own lives. Yeah. They're not problems that need to be managed or corrected. However, historically, neurological differences have often been framed as deficits. And often that was to justify, or came with a sense of justifying, external control from educators, for example, from workplaces, parents, institutions. And I have here on my notes as well from clinicians, but maybe I shouldn't have said that out loud. But there is perhaps some truth to that. But autonomy means that neurodivergent people are experts on their own experiences. I'm going to repeat that. Autonomy means that neurodivergent people are experts on their own experiences, and that differences are not inherently pathologies. Yeah? And that support should be chosen and not sort of imposed. And so things become consent-based, reflecting the participants' values rather than the teacher's comfort or the conventional way of mainstream mindfulness teaching. Yeah, but we've always done it this way. Maybe not. And it's really important because people thrive when they have choice and control over how they learn. Hi there, Hara. It was lovely to briefly see you. Welcome to the session. So you might think, okay, well, that's great, and I understand that, but I have a curriculum to teach. And so where does that autonomy fit in? Well, you'll be pleased to know, maybe you won't be pleased to know. I don't know. I can't make that assumption. One thing I've learned from working with Liezl is how often one tends to make assumptions, myself included. We say that like, oh, you might feel like this. It's like, whoa, that's an assumption. So my message is that neurodivergent participants generally, overall, benefit from the teacher sticking to the announced program and the activities and the timings. But a key message here is pacing, because neurodivergent people will process information at very different speeds, and some can follow with ease and others will prefer and need more time to integrate information. So that might throw you a little bit, and I certainly know that it has thrown me at times, because I may use a poem or I may use a metaphor, and all of a sudden it's like something shifts in the energy in the space. And it's because some people are requiring more time to process, to integrate, to reflect, to contemplate. And there's obviously there's nothing wrong with that. But if I'm not aware of that as a mindfulness teacher, then my teaching in that moment is no longer neuro-affirming. It is traditional, conventional, mainstream mindfulness teaching. This is the poem that I'm supposed to teach, and we are now supposed to move on to the next page of the curriculum. It doesn't work like that. So having that awareness of what might be going on in the group can help you with pacing accordingly. With regards to the learning environment and handing out workbooks, etc., know that from the room temperature to sitting in a circle to using a meditation bell, things that you and I may be very used to using as mindfulness teachers are not always appreciated by neurodivergent participants. The bell to someone with misophonia can sound really sharp. Sitting in a circle for some people is going to be really uncomfortable. 1 or 2 degrees in centigrade difference in temperature in a room can really affect somebody's nervous system in not always the best way, and therefore connecting with the learning with the teaching, and therefore the learning is likely to be compromised. And finally, something around handouts and workbooks. Because you may have your one way of doing this, like I always send them out in advance, or I always send them out the next day or a few days after the session. Ask your participants, because some will really feel more emotionally and cognitively prepared when they can see what they can expect from a session, what the breakout room activities will be. It's all about reducing uncertainty as best we can as teachers for our participants. So a few things to consider there. So let's take a couple of seconds to pause here as well and give ourselves an opportunity to reflect on what you might need to consider in your teaching with regards to autonomy. Or is it very often a bit of a one-way street, so to speak? And if in this moment it comes across a little bit scary, perhaps a little bit like, not so sure about that, then that's a really valuable emotion to notice. And it can very much be here. I wrestled with a lot of this stuff, quote unquote stuff, for about 6 months. And now I can't go back to the conventional way of teaching. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand over back to Liezl, who will take us through the third spoke, connecting.
That's right. So third spoke is connection. And here's a bit of cheesiness coming at you. You've got to respect to connect. Do you like that? So the point here is, in order for us to make a good connection, we really need to work on our respect of the people in front of us. And how do we know we're respected? Well, when we know we're seen, right? The language we use makes a big difference, right? So neuro-affirming, non-pathologizing language, where we're not discussing people's needs as deficits, where we respect people's very diverse ways of communicating. You know, some people, like me, will talk nonstop given an opportunity. And it's not because they're rude. It's not because they're not very clever. It's because some people absolutely need to hear the words to be able to process it, because it doesn't work so well without hearing it. Some folks need it to be quiet while they're processing. And so someone like me would be a complete difficulty for them, because they need the peace to be able to make the process, do the processing. And sometimes, as Christoph mentioned, we need to keep in mind how we're going with the pacing. And so if someone's need is to talk a lot, we need to make agreements at the beginning of when we start our course to say, look, I know some of you lot need to talk a lot to get this processed, and I'm going to give you as much space as I can so we can make sure that happens. And at the same time, because we want to make sure that we use the time we've got as well as we can, if I need to, let's discuss a way of how I can interrupt you in a respectful way that allows us to carry on when we need to, but still gives you space. And then there's the old microaggression. If somebody feels that you are saying something that is not safe for them, your connection is not going to happen because they don't feel respected. So examples for neurodivergent people might be, oh, we're all a bit on the spectrum. Have I heard that one? We're not all a bit on the spectrum when it comes to being neurodivergent. And you don't have to have a diagnosis to be properly autistic, but you can have autistic traits without being autistic. Do you see what I mean? So it kind of muddies the waters. I'm using lots of metaphors here. Muddies the waters around somebody's identity, and that's a microaggression. Another one might be, that's crazy. Mental health, are we now using that as a sort of throwaway remark? It's really important to recognize the terms that we use and how they might affect people around us. And here's the next one. Humor is something I love using to connect with people. It is a very useful tool until we use forms of humor that doesn't land for everyone. Sarcasm, for example. People who think in very linear ways sometimes take things literally. And so, you know, sarcasm is talking in opposites, basically. And so if people won't know if you're joking, if you're serious, and they won't be part of the joke, which means your connection's gone. So if you're going to use sarcasm, I'm not saying stop being you. I'm saying do that and explain the joke so that everyone's in on it. And then when we're getting to inquiry, like I mentioned earlier, the how we do it, the whether people do it with speaking, whether people would like to do it in chat if they're online. Some folk would prefer to do it in writing. And honouring enough time for people to process when you've asked the question or when you're even waiting for someone to participate in it. And as always, autonomy really, really matters. A pass is okay. If you've asked a question and somebody says, not doing it, that's not disrespect. That's them holding their own boundary, and it's our place to go, well done you for picking your choice on this. So at the end of this spoke of connection, which was mapped onto the MBI TAC relational domain 2, let's take a pause. I will give us about 30 seconds and to reflect on what could I do early on to support connection in my group. I will admit that I have lost control of my stopwatch, so I'm going to guess at 30 seconds and say, Christoph,
Correct.
when you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Liezl. And before we continue, because we're about sort of halfway through the spokes, just to acknowledge the arrival of more colleagues into the space. So we're grateful for your presence. We are currently taking you through a framework consisting of 7 spokes, because we're using a wheel as our framework, 7 spokes that help us make our mindfulness teaching more neuro-affirming. And the first spoke was compass, which is all about safety. The second spoke was considering, which is all about considering people's autonomy. The third spoke was connecting, which is all about respect. And I'm about to explain the spoke of congruence, which maps onto the embodying domain of the MBI TAC. And it's all about going more explicit and explaining. And I'm about to explain what that means now. And by the way, we tend to say embodying because it's sort of a never-ending process. It's never a final state. So we prefer embodying over embodiment, in case you were wondering about that. So why do we call it congruence? Because it's about the congruence between the teacher's internal experience and their outward behavior. Yeah, but some of that behavior in conventional mindfulness teaching, I mean, you might have a different opinion of that, but certainly the way I was trained is that conventional embodying tends to be serene, equanimous, calm. You know, you might be familiar with the saying, mindfulness is caught rather than taught. And there's tremendous value in that for sure. But this implicit model of conveying learning and conveying mindfulness may not serve the neurodivergent participant in the group. And here's why. Because if this is the perception, ambiguous behavior, there's something really serious and deep happening here, and this teacher just sits there really serene looking, and I find that a bit strange perhaps. That is going to increase, or is likely to increase, feelings of uneasiness and unsureness, and then the barrier increases between the teacher and the participant, and that might increase a sense of feeling unsafe. And when that level is reached, then the learning is very likely to stop altogether. So what we suggest is a more explicit, more transparent embodying instead. So for example, I find it really helpful to sometimes, when I need to integrate some information, process something that's been shared in the group, or maybe it's my own stuff, I find it helpful to give myself a few moments to look away from the screen, to look away from the people in the group if it's an in-person space, and look out of the window. It really helps me to self-regulate. Now, my experience is valid, right? So I should be allowed to do that, but not always to the conventional teaching manual, shall we say, right? Because it might be seen as a disconnect between me and the group. No, absolutely not. I can be super connected to my group as long as I make it explicit. I explain to my group, if you see me looking away, this is why I'm doing this. because it is helpful, but I'm very much connected to you. And that removes the uncertainty. Yeah, it removes people potentially thinking, did I say something wrong? Did I upset Christoph? What's going on here? And this is really important, because the benefit for me is that I don't have to put on a performance. Yeah, I don't have to pretend to look calm. If I'm not calm, it's okay to find my way to self-regulate in that moment, as long as I communicate it to my participants. And for the people in the group, you see how easily the me-they dynamic kicks in. So shame on me, but I'd rather name it in real time, hoping that it helps you to avoid that, because we're ussing and damming, and it happens so naturally. So my apologies for that. But the people in my group don't have to guess about what on earth my behavior is about, because I make it more explicit, more transparent. And this is important, just to wrap this up, because sensitivity is real. There are, in particular, rejection sensitivity and justice sensitivity. And I'm looking at my notes because it's important that I get this right. Rejection sensitivity is this heightened emotional and physical response to perceived or actual rejection, criticism, and disapproval. Yeah, which is usually rooted in repeated past experience of rejection due to being misunderstood. So that is the last thing we want to sort of instill in the people in the group. So clarity is going to be super helpful. Embodying also is all about embodying the mindfulness attitudes. Now, be very careful of that, because here too the justice sensitivity might come in, this heightened attunement to fairness and ethics and harm. So we have to be careful how we talk about the attitude of acceptance, for example, and remembering that and explaining explicitly, underscoring that acceptance means something exists. And then we can work with that. It doesn't mean we have to approve of it. It doesn't mean we have to accept it. Just something exists. Because how these concepts that we teach come across with some people in the group is likely to be very different from how you might understand they usually come across. So let's take a moment here too, a few seconds to settle before we move on to conducting. So how does your embodying generally sort of unfold? Is it quite implicit? Do people have to guess what's going on within you? Or do you verbalize it more explicitly? There's no right or wrong here. We're just sharing adaptations. Thank you, everyone. Liezl, thank you for your patience.
Patience, he says to an ADHDer. I'll get you. Okay.
That's a microaggression right there.
No, that wasn't micro, that was intentional.
Right, good luck, everybody. So bye-bye. I'm just gonna
see ya. Right, we're on to spoke 5, conducting. And the guiding word here is adjusting. Is how can I adjust what's going on to match with what's necessary right now? And if we're looking at the MBI TAC, that maps onto domain 4, which is guiding. So Christoph mentioned autonomy way early on, and it matters everywhere. But how you run your session really needs to be adapted in order to allow people their autonomy wherever possible. So we might want to give people complete permission to be themselves. And we didn't mention it at the beginning, but for those of you who are in the room, if you feel the need to stand up and have a little walk around, please do. If you need to go out and come back in again, go and do that too. Your body is your place to live. You get to choose how you use it. It also means things like eye contact might be something we want to consider here. We can say to people, look, I know not everyone's going to look at me. And it doesn't mean anything. It just means that that's maybe what they're comfortable with or not comfortable with. Whether we have our eyes open or closed during practice, what anchor we choose. Not everyone's going to want to choose a breath every time. especially if there's any kind of past trauma going on, the breath can sometimes be a very, very uncomfortable place to try and anchor yourself. Whatever posture you use, and I've mentioned about the movement and the going out and in. Offering multiple anchors. So sometimes it's not so easy to just use one anchor, especially if you've got the kind of mind I have that will start off with one anchor and then off it goes. And actually trying to bring it back to just one anchor is hard. So I might use a focus tool, which brings in the tactile. So for me, that's just my mala. I carry that around with me all the time. So I've always got it at hand if I want to do something. I recognize I'm talking at 100 miles an hour. I'll try and slow it down. Or we might use something like sound. We might use something that's internal. What's my belly doing right now? My feet doing right now? How does it feel? And then when it comes to using the breath as a focus point, we can combine it with others. So for example, on the in-breath, for breath, we might want to use lotus hands. So what I mean by that is start off with the fingers together like a chef's kiss. And on the in-breath, open the hand, and on the out breath, close the hand. I've seen this work so well for people who struggle with just sticking to the breath. So in breath, open, out breath, closed. And that way, if your mind's wandering, you've got two things to bring it back to. Some people really find it helpful to have their hands on their belly to feel the movement. Some people have great difficulty putting their hands on their belly. So we might bring in some movement. We might go, right, so on my in-breath, I'm going to sway to one side, and on the out-breath, I'm going to sway to the other side. And if you're doing this online, it's easier to do this. You might want to include sound. You might want to hum on the out-breath and silent on the in-breath. Whatever helps. Whatever is adjustable in how we guide this. And then there's the whole sensory adaptation, right? Some people, and sometimes I'm a bit like this, will find the big light in the room a personal attack. I mean, this is a bit of hyperbole here, but if you're sitting in a room and it's slightly dark, or you walk into a room and it's slightly dark and you see me sitting in it, don't switch on the light, or at least ask permission, or give me a minute so I can get out or shut my eyes. Things like noises, if you know it's going to be very noisy, maybe we can try and work out a way of reducing that, or we can acknowledge it and say, we know this is probably getting in the way, but it's what we've got right now. Smells, depending on where you are, if there's anything you can do about smells, let's try and do that if we can, or name it and go, we recognize this as an obstacle, or maybe an obstacle. And textures, if you're doing it in person, really keep in mind what your environment is like and what you can adapt to help people along. And then when it comes to language, Christoph was mentioning poems earlier. If you're using poems, we need to know that the person who wrote that poem had an intention in mind, and how it lands is not necessarily how the poet wrote it, on the one hand. On the other hand, some people just cannot connect with poems. And so it's really important, in the same way as when we were talking about humor earlier, that you give the poetic thing, because that really works for some people, but you also give some really concrete information around it so that you make it clear what the intention was with offering that poem. It offers, if we can offer ourselves a sustainable pace, that really helps. And always to keep people in that, the comfort, stretch, panic model. If we can keep people somewhere in the stretch model, or give them the opportunity to be somewhere in the stretch model, they're going to learn and grow. If we keep them so comfortable the whole time, nothing's changing. And if we keep them in panic, nobody's learning anything either. So it's important to give people the autonomy to be able to stay in that stretch mode. Yes. So here's the thing. There's a lot going on, as you may have noticed. We're talking at 100 miles an hour, we're saying a lot. And Christoph and I have a very detailed resource that you can get from us afterwards if that's going to help you. So you can get in touch with us about that. So shall we give ourselves another 30 seconds to reflect? Pause, reflect, maybe make some notes for the Q&A. And maybe ask, how can I adjust my sessions to offer more support? Okay, that's our 30 seconds. Christoph, it's yours for conveying.
Thank you, Liezl. Yeah. Conveying, the penultimate spoke, which is all about conveying the learning themes through inquiry and didactic teaching. Maps on pretty literally with the MBI TAC domain of conveying. And this spoke is all about access. That is the guiding word. Because how can people engage with your inquiry? How can they engage with your didactic teaching if they can't access it in the first place? And for me, this was a very steep learning curve metaphor right there. This was difficult learning for me. That's another conversation, how easily metaphors slip into into my teaching. And again, some people will connect with those and others won't. I feel that, and this is often how it works, because Liezl and I, we bounce off each other, that Liezl has already mentioned the importance of, I'm talking to inquiry now, the importance to not interrupt people, because some participants will need to speak out loud to understand and to process and to integrate. They need to verbalize it in order to understand their experience. Others will want to have extra time. Others still will want to move. I love what Dr. Tamara Russell says about movement. She says, what if thoughts are movements trapped in the mind? What if thoughts are movement trapped in the mind? I'm like that. I can sit and write an essay and nothing flows, and I get up, I go for a walk, and it just pours out of me. So I need to move to think. The nutshell of this metaphor right there. So the point here is that it may seem to us as teachers that somebody is overly verbal, too extroverted, stands up and wants to move, and what's that all about? How dare they interrupt the equanimous feeling in the room? But that's how it is for some participants, and we need to honor their autonomy and give them permission to do that. Yeah. So it's as best we can noticing that and then avoiding interrupting. Because sometimes teachers, I'll speak to my own experience, it can be so tempting to move to a certain layer within the inquiry. We want to take people somewhere, and if it's not happening, then sometimes we guide people along. And in doing so, we undermine we invalidate their experience in that moment. So yeah, important. There is more to the inquiry. Well, it's lifelong learning, all of this, isn't it? But I'll move on in the interest of time to the didactic teaching, because one thing that was also really helpful for me to understand is how I love teaching about the stress reaction cycle and the vicious flower and all of these models. But when I was using words like reactivity, maladaptive, dysfunctional, those terms tend to come from the medical model and actually can be quite shameful, condemning. And because often we are talking about the very behaviors that have been adaptive survival strategies for people in the group. So, and it wasn't until one of the neurodivergent people in my group pointed that out to me very helpfully, because they knew I was learning, right? So I was helping them, they were helping me. And I was like, oh my goodness, Lord only knows how many people I have involuntarily offended in previous MBSR courses, because these people had told me about their neurodivergence, but many people, like Liezl said, they might not share it with you, or they may not even be aware that they are neurodivergent. So here is some helpful ND neurodiversity friendly framing. So something like reactivity and response can become different options and different consequences, yeah, which removes this sort of moral hierarchy of good versus bad. Maladaptive can be not currently helpful, yeah? Not currently helpful. And even a more neutral word, such as perception, for example, how things appear to you in this moment, which may change. And what can be really helpful is to come up with a shared sort of shared meaning making principle. So creating a lexicon together. So this is what I'm teaching about today. It's super interesting. These are the words that we tend to use. I'm aware that they may come across differently. What do you make of it? And how can we meet each other halfway? And that honesty, that transparency is going to, in my opinion, it's going to serve you really well until you become fluent with that sort of new language. And then, yeah, maybe you can run with it more easily. So thank you. We're moving straight into, in the interest of time, into the final spoke, which is really sort of the shortest one, community. And the guiding word here is difference, interestingly enough. Liezl.
Thank you, Christoph. Yeah, we are at the very last bit, and we are nibbling into your Q&A time, so I'm going to make this as quick as I can, but community really matters. The seventh spoke is about difference. It's the domain 6 in the MBI TAC, and it's about holding the group. So when we learn mindfulness, this idea of common humanity really matters, except if we assume that's all there is, I've mentioned it earlier, then all the intersectioning identities we've got can start getting eroded and erased. So we are all human and we are all different. And that's how we can make a community. We don't get to be a community if we're all exactly the same. That's not really a community. If we can acknowledge that our differences are real, number one, and number two, are fluctuating, for example, our needs, then it becomes more of a community. Then we're genuinely interacting with each other. So there's no assumed sameness. We're co-creating, like Christoph just said about the what words we use. That makes us a community. So now the teacher stops being a leader and the teacher actually becomes a companion. We're all on an equal footing, and that makes the place a whole lot safer, and it makes us feel more connected. Group development, the whole Tuckman business of forming, storming, norming, adjourning, and all that, performing, and it doesn't necessarily go in a linear way for neurodivergent people, and especially the storming part can be internal. It can be something that someone experiences on their own, where they're recognizing how they're different from other people, and maybe they can use that to beat themselves up. Also not a literal thing, right? How they can criticize themselves for not being the same, and therefore thinking maybe they're not as mindful as other people. And so it helps to be flexible, to allow people flexibility and participation. So, do you want to take part in the sharing? No. Okay, that's fine. There's no pressing anyone into anything. And then when it comes to the whole common humanity language that we use, we often go around saying we all this, and don't we think this, our this, and us that. If we assume, then we are getting rid of some of the identities of the people in our group. Yeah, there's all kinds of examples of that, but let's keep in mind that all the different parts of every person matters, and all the differences that change up and down for each person every day matters. And that's how we build a community. So at the end of this spoke, the final one, the key word is difference. And I'm going to give you a second or two to get your head around what you want to say in there, and also to maybe connect again with your intention and your motivation that you said at the beginning of today's talk. The why we're here and why that matters. What am I doing here and why does it matter?